They tell you grief fades, they lie. For 3 years, Alpha King Killian of Ashwood has slept beside an empty pillow that still smells faintly of ash and lavender, because no war, no council, and no woman has ever convinced him to let it go. He buried a casket he was never allowed to open. He mourned a body that was never found. His court moved on. His council grew impatient. But Killian never stopped waiting for a woman who was never coming back, until the one night he swore he'd never dance again. In a hall built by the very kingdom his people blame for her murder, surrounded by masks and music and old hatred dressed as peace, a scent stops him cold. Her scent, 3 years buried and somehow alive, wrapped in his enemy's arms, answering to a name that isn't hers, smiling at a man who isn't him. His hands go still, his wolf goes silent, and one thought moves through him like ice through water. Remove the mask. Because some graves don't stay closed. Before we continue, please like and subscribe to Tina's Romance Room. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and let's see how far Killian's story travels. Now, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The door to Winter's chambers had not opened in 3 years, and Killian still walked past it every morning as though she might be waiting on the other side. He never went in. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he'd find: a hairbrush still holding a few silver blonde strands, a wedding cloak folded over a chair, the faint ghost of lavender and ash that no amount of stillness had managed to erase. Grief, he'd learned, doesn't fade. It just gets quiet enough to live with. "You're doing the thing again," Barrett said, falling into step beside him in the corridor, arms full of ledgers he clearly had no intention of reading. "The staring at a door thing. The council's going to start charging admission." Killian didn't answer. Barrett had earned the right to needle him. 3 years of loyalty bought a man that much. But there were mornings even his best friend's humor slid off him like rain off stone. "Speaking of the council," Barrett continued, undeterred, "they've found you a new one. Lady Sarai. Sweet girl. Terrifying mother. She's been practicing her curtsy in the East Hall for a week." As if summoned, Sarai appeared at the end of the corridor, spotted Killian, and attempted said curtsy while balancing a tray of pastries meant to charm him. She succeeded at neither. The tray tipped, a scone met the flagstones with a sound like small applause, and Sarai froze mid-bow, mortified, muttering an apology to the pastry itself before fleeing with what remained of her dignity. Killian felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the closest thing to a smile the castle had seen from him in months, and then it was gone, filed away with everything else he no longer let himself feel for long. "The choosing moon is in 6 weeks, Barrett said, gentler now. "The council won't wait past it. You know that." "I know. They're not wrong to push, Killian. A kingdom needs a Luna. I had one." The words landed the way they always did, final, immovable, closing the conversation like a door pulled shut. Barrett didn't push further. He never did, not on this. It was the royal steward, breathless and pale, who broke the silence properly. A sealed letter held out like it might bite him. Duskmoor's crest. The kingdom his court had cursed for 3 years. The one his people believed had slaughtered his convoy and stolen his wife from the world. A formal proposal of peace, requesting the Alpha King's presence at a summit within the month. The hall went still. Even Barrett stopped joking. "Burn it," someone murmured from the council table. "Send their heads back the letter instead." Killian read it twice. Something in him, something he hadn't let move in 3 years, shifted, quiet and unwelcome, like a door easing open a crack he swore he'd nailed shut. "I'll go myself," he said. The hall erupted in protest. He didn't hear a word of it. He was already thinking of a scent he hadn't smelled in 3 years, and a hope he refused, even silently, to name. Chapter 2. Duskmoor's great hall had been built to intimidate, and it did its job well. Black stones soared into shadow overhead, banners the color of dried blood hung between the pillars, and every wolf in the room wore a mask that hid nothing about the way they watched him. Killian walked in, flanked by Barrett and 6 guards he suspected were more decoration than protection, and felt 3 years of hatred pressed flat beneath careful, gleaming hospitality. Smile, Barrett murmured. We're guests. We're prey, wearing crowns. That too. Dorian received him at the base of the dais, tall, composed, a king who wore his authority the way other men wore armor. His greeting was correct in every particular, and warm in none of them. Killian returned it in kind, and the two of them exchanged the sort of pleasantries that meant nothing and cost everything, while beneath it, both men measured the other for weakness. Then the music shifted, the crowd parted for the dance, and the scent hit him. Lavender, ash. Underneath it, something warmer. Skin, sleep, home. 3 years buried, and here it was, moving through a hostile ballroom like it belonged there. Killian turned before he decided to. She was dancing near the center of the floor, silver mask catching the candlelight, silver blonde hair pinned the way Winter used to pin hers when she was pretending not to care how she looked, the tilt of her head, the particular, unhurried grace of her turn. His chest did something violent and wordless. "Who is that?" he said, and didn't recognize his own voice. Barrett followed his gaze and stiffened. "Lady Emerald." Dorian's ward, apparently. Nobody seems to know much more than that. Killian was already moving. He cut in before Dorian's steward could object, a diplomatic gesture no host could refuse without insult, and then her hand was in his. Up close, the mask couldn't hide everything. The shape of her jaw, the small scar above her eyebrow he'd kissed 100 times without thinking. Her eyes, though. Her eyes looked at him like he was a stranger. "You dance like someone who's counting the exits," he said quietly, testing. "A habit of mine. Polite, empty, nothing behind it." He tried again, lower, deliberate, a phrase only Winter would know. Something whispered once in a garden the night he proposed, a private joke about ash trees and stubborn kings. Her steps faltered, just barely, not recognition, alarm. "I'm sorry," she said, pulling back half a step. "Have we met?" "No," he said, and the word cost him more than he expected. "My mistake." Dorian was there before the song ended, a hand settling at her waist with an ease that made Killian's wolf snarl low in his chest. "Emerald," Dorian said, smooth, watchful. "The summit's opening remarks." She went with him without hesitation, didn't look back once. Killian stood alone at the edge of the floor, 3 years of careful numbness cracked wide open by a woman who'd looked straight through him like glass. Killian. Barrett, at his shoulder, quiet. "You're shaking." He hadn't noticed. He noticed now. Chapter 3. He found Dorian in the map room an hour before the border talks, alone with a glass of something dark and a stack of treaties he wasn't reading. "A word," Killian said, "on the eastern grazing lines." It wasn't about the grazing lines, and they both knew it within the first 10 seconds. "Your ward," Killian said, closing the door behind him. "Lady Emerald. Where did you find her?" Something flickered behind Dorian's eyes. There and gone. Quick as a struck match. Why does that concern the Alpha King of Ashwood? Answer the question. "She was brought to my border 3 years ago. Half dead. No memory of who she'd been." Dorian's voice was level. It's rehearsed in the way of a lie told so many times it had worn smooth. "I gave her a home. That's the whole of it. 3 years ago." Killian's wolf was pressing against his ribs, close to the surface. "The same season my convoy was ambushed. The same season my wife disappeared. Kingdoms lose people every season, Killian. That doesn't make them yours." "I never said her name." Dorian didn't answer that. He set down his glass instead, very carefully, the way a man sets down something he'd rather throw, and Killian understood, with a certainty that turned his blood to ice water, that he'd just watched a king lie badly for the first time in his life. Barrett caught up with him in the corridor outside, half out of breath. "So, how'd that go? Judging by your face, badly, or you've decided to start a second war before lunch?" "He's lying." "Great, wonderful. Very useful information for the council when I tell them their king wants to march on Duskmoor, because a woman smelled like his dead wife at a dance. Barrett fell into step beside him. Tone light, eyes not light at all. Killian, I'm with you. I've been with you 3 years of doors that don't open and dinners you don't eat. But you have to hear how this sounds. I know how it sounds. Then slow down. Killian didn't answer that either. Across the castle, in a sunlit sitting room she still didn't quite think of as hers, Winter sat with a needle unmoving in her hand, listening to a voice carry faintly down the corridor outside. Low, rough, familiar in a way that had no right to be familiar. Something in her chest pulled tight, unbidden, painful. A door she didn't have a key for, rattling anyway. Emerald, Dorian, in the doorway, watching her with the particular gentleness he always used when she looked like this. Pale, distant, somewhere else. You've gone somewhere. I don't know where, she admitted. There's a voice. I keep hearing it, and I don't know why it hurts. He crossed the room and knelt by her chair, taking her hand like it was something breakable. The Ashwood King has that effect on people. Grief does strange things to a stranger's nerves. A lie, soft and careful, dressed in concern so convincing she had no reason to doubt it. Rest today, he said. Stay away from the hall until the evening session. She nodded, because he'd never once given her a reason not to trust him. But the ache didn't fade. It only waited. Chapter 4. The assignment came from Dorian's steward, delivered with the particular blandness of a man who has no idea he's lighting a fuse. Lady Emerald would serve as liaison between the two courts for the duration of the summit, translating schedules, mediating disputes over seating and precedence, and the 1,000 small vanities that came with housing 2 kingdoms under one roof. Killian suspected, watching Dorian's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly at the announcement, that it hadn't been his idea at all, which meant, for the next several days, she was simply there, across the table during border disputes, at his elbow during ceremonial dinners, correcting the seating chart when Barrett tried to place a Duskmore general next to a man he'd once challenged to a duel. You do that on purpose, Killian said, the 3rd time he caught her rearranging place cards with a perfectly straight face. I have no idea what you mean. She didn't look up. General Holloway simply does better with his back to the window. He does better nowhere near Commander Ash. You're separating them because you know exactly what happened at the border talks 2 years ago. I couldn't possibly. A pause, and then, so dry it took him a moment to catch it, although I hear it involved a horse, an insult, and considerably less dignity than either man would like remembered. It startled a laugh out of him, short, rusty, unfamiliar in his own throat, and he saw something flicker across her face too, surprise at her own wit, pleasure she hadn't expected to feel. For a moment, neither of them seemed to know what to do with it. It kept happening. She was quick in a way that matched him blow for blow, unbothered by his silences, unimpressed by his crown, and it was easier to sit across from her than it had been to sit across from anyone in 3 years. He told himself it was relief at competent company. He didn't fully believe it. It was during the 4th day's session, as she reached across the table to move a treaty toward him, that her sleeve slipped and he saw it. A thin, pale scar tracing the inside of her left wrist, curved like a crescent moon. He knew that scar. He knew exactly where it came from. A girl of 9, climbing the ash trees behind her father's healing house. A broken bottle hidden in the leaves, blood on her sleeve and her father's hands shaking as he stitched it closed. She'd told Killian the story herself, years later, tracing the mark for him in the dark of their marriage bed, laughing at how her father had cried harder than she had. No one else knew that story. No one else could. Killian, she said, following his gaze to her own wrist, tugging her sleeve down out of some instinct she couldn't name. Is something wrong? No, he said, old scar. Curious, that's all. I don't actually remember getting it, she admitted, almost embarrassed. Before Duskmore is mostly fog. Dorian says it doesn't matter. It matters, Killian said, quieter than he meant to. Across the hall, Barrett watched his king go still in that particular way, the way he used to go still standing outside a door he wouldn't open, and set down his wine without drinking it. Something was coming. Barrett had learned, over 3 years, to trust that silence more than he trusted anything Killian actually said. Chapter 5. The full moon rose over Duskmoor's gardens, thick and silver, and Winter felt it pull at something under her skin the way it always did. Except tonight, it pulled differently, insistently, toward the east terrace instead of her own balcony. She told herself she only wanted air. She didn't entirely believe it by the time she found Killian already standing there, alone, face turned up to the light. He didn't seem surprised to see her. That, more than anything, unsettled her. "Your wolf brought you here too," he said. "Not a question." "I don't know why." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the night wasn't cold. "It's never done that before. Pulled me anywhere. Tonight, it's been restless since sundown." "Mine too." They stood in silence that should have been awkward and wasn't. Beneath her ribs, something ancient and wordless strained toward him like a compass needle finding north, and she hated how right it felt, how little sense that made. "Can I try something?" Killian said, careful, quiet, a man diffusing something he wasn't sure would explode. "A song, it might mean nothing. I'd like to know either way." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He hummed it low at first, then let words find it. A child's lullaby about ash trees and steady moons, about a girl who was braver than she knew. His voice cracked once, halfway through, and he pushed through it anyway. The pain hit her like a wall. Not memory, no faces, no names, nothing she could hold, just raw, wordless agony, a scream trapped somewhere behind her ribs for 3 years, finally clawing for the surface. She staggered, hand flying to her temple, and Killian caught her before she hit the stone, murmuring her name, her real name, like it might anchor her to something solid. "Winter, Winter, look at me. Get away from her." Dorian's voice cracked across the terrace like a whip. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, wolf half risen in his eyes, and hauled her from Killian's arms with a force that startled all 3 of them. "She nearly died once," Dorian snarled, putting himself bodily between them. "Do you understand that? I found her in pieces, and you sing her a song and reduce her to this." "I sang her the truth," Killian said, and his voice had gone dangerously flat, dangerously calm. "Something you've spent 3 years keeping from her. You don't know what I've kept her from. Then tell me. Get off my land." The air between them went taut as a drawn bowstring, wolves surfacing in both men's eyes, gold and gray, old hatred finally shrugging off its diplomatic mask. It was Winter, shaking, gripping the terrace rail, tears she couldn't explain sliding down her face, who spoke before either king could throw the first blow. "Stop." Just that. But something in her voice, raw and commanding in a way neither of them had heard from her before, cut through both wolves at once. "Both of you, stop." Killian stepped back first. Dorian, a beat later, did the same, though his arm never left her. "I don't know what that was," she whispered, staring at her own trembling hands. "But it wasn't nothing. It wasn't nothing, Dorian." For the first time since she'd known him, Dorian had no answer at all. Chapter 6. She didn't sleep. By dawn she was standing in Dorian's study, still in last night's gown, arms crossed against a chill that had nothing to do with the air. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the story you've told me for 3 years. The truth. All of it." Dorian, seated at his desk, looked older suddenly, the composure he wore like armor slipping for the first time since she'd known him. "Emerald. That isn't even my name, is it?" The silence that followed answered her more honestly than he had in 3 years. "I found you at the border," he said finally, slow, as though each word cost him something. "Half drowned, half frozen, bleeding from a wound that should have killed you outright. You had no memory of anything. Not your name, not your kingdom, not the ring I had to cut from your finger because your hand had swollen around it." He stopped, made himself continue. "There was a crest on the wreckage nearby. Ashwoods. I knew whose wife you likely were within the week." "You knew?" Her voice came out very quiet. "You knew, and you let me believe I had no one. I told myself it was mercy. You were in pieces, Emerald, Winter, and every physician who examined you warned that forcing memory back too soon could break you entirely. I told myself I was protecting you. He looked up at her then, and whatever else he was, whatever he'd taken from her, the naked truth in his face was not performance. And somewhere in that first winter, protecting you stopped being the only reason. I love you. I have for 3 years. That's the whole of it, uglier than I ever wanted you to see. She said nothing. There was nothing gentle enough to say back, and nothing cruel enough either. Miles east, at the scorched clearing where a royal convoy had died 3 years ago, Killian knelt in ash that had long since gone cold, and found a witness Barrett had spent 2 sleepless nights tracking down. An old trapper who'd watched the whole ambush from the tree line, too frightened to come forward until a king himself was asking. "Weren't Duskmore colors," the old man said, hands shaking around his own cup of nettle tea. "I've trapped that border 30 years, my lord. I know Duskmore gray when I see it. Those wolves wore no colors at all. Masked. Deliberate. Like men who wanted the blame to land somewhere else." Killian felt the ground shift beneath 3 years of certainty. "You're sure," he said, though he already knew the answer. "Sure as I'm sitting here, my lord." Barrett, beside him, had gone very pale. "Killian, if Duskmore didn't do this, then someone framed them for it." Killian rose slowly, ash falling from his knees like gray snow. Someone who wanted a war between 2 kingdoms, and a queen erased cleanly enough that no one came looking. Someone with access to Ashwood colors, Ashwood routes, Ashwood's convoy schedule. Barrett's voice had lost every trace of its usual humor. "Killian, that's not an outsider. That's someone inside your own walls." Killian said nothing. He was already thinking of council chambers, of advisors who'd stood beside him through 3 years of mourning, with faces full of sympathy, and wondering, for the first time, which of them had been counting on him never asking this question at all. Chapter 7. The road back to Ashwood took less than a day, and Killian used every hour of it to plan a burglary against his own castle. "Say that plan out loud again," Barrett said, not for the first time. "The part where we break into the Royal Archive. Your archive. The one you own. Marcellus doesn't know we suspect him. If I walk in and demand convoy records, he'll have 3 days to burn whatever's left before I can prove anything. This has to look like nothing. It does not currently look like nothing." It looked, in fact, like 2 men in dark cloaks crouched behind a hedge at midnight, which was when Sarai found them, quite literally tripped over Barrett in the dark, let out a shriek that could have woken the entire East Wing, and then, to both men's astonishment, clapped a hand over her own mouth and dropped into a crouch beside them without a single further question. "You're robbing the archive," she whispered, delighted. "I want to help." "Absolutely not," Killian said. "I know the Night Guard's rotation. I know which seal Marcellus keeps under his blotter because I once had to fetch a treaty for him and watched him unlock it with his eyes closed, the way men do when they've done something 100 times without thinking. You need me." She was, infuriatingly, correct. 20 minutes later, she was pressing a forged wax seal to a requisition slip with the calm precision of a woman who had clearly been underestimated her entire life, while Barrett kept watch, and Killian searched the convoy ledgers by candlelight, finally finding it, a route change, filed the very week of the ambush, in handwriting he recognized instantly, Marcellus's own. It was Sarai's quick thinking, not Killian's crown, that saved them when a guard's footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. She shoved the ledger into Barrett's cloak, seized his arm, and loudly announced to the empty hallway that she absolutely would not be lectured about propriety by a beta who didn't even know how to properly escort a lady to a candlelit archive at midnight. Thank you very much. The guard, thoroughly embarrassed, retreated without a second look. Barrett didn't stop laughing, silent and shaking, until they were 3 corridors away, half from relief and half from genuine, helpless delight. "You," he told Sarai, "are wasted on that council." "I know," she said, and for the first time since the story began, she didn't sound like she was performing anything at all. "In Duskmore, Winter had her own quiet reckoning. Searching Dorian's study for anything that might explain the fog behind her eyes, she found a locket tucked in the false bottom of a drawer. Inside it, a portrait too faded to place, and beneath that, a small leather book filled with handwriting that made her hands go cold. Her own hand. Entries about a garden, a husband, a wedding beneath ash trees. Dorian had told her he'd simply found the locket among her things. He had never once mentioned the book. She sat with it a long time, grief and fury tangled too tightly to separate. Neither Killian nor Winter knew, that same night, that Marcellus stood at his window in Ashwood, watching the archive lights flicker where none should be burning, understanding with cold and total clarity that 3 years of careful silence was unraveling at last. He began, without hurry, to plan how to bury it properly this time. Chapter 8. The summit's final night gathered both courts back into Duskmoor's great hall, candlelight thick as honey, the old hatred between the two kingdoms wearing its finest clothes for one last performance. At midnight, tradition demanded, every mask in the room would come off at once, a symbol of peace, of nothing left hidden between two courts finally done with war. Killian arrived with the ledger sewn into his cloak and Barrett at his shoulder, watching the crowd the way a man watches a room he suspects is about to catch fire. He found Marcellus near the dais before Marcellus found him, composed, gracious, playing councilman as effortlessly as he always had, and Killian understood, watching him bow to Dorian's court with perfect ease, exactly how a man hides 3 years of blood behind good manners. "My king," Marcellus said, warm as ever. "A fine piece, don't you think? Everything we hoped for. Everything you engineered," Killian said quietly, close enough that only Marcellus could hear. "I have the ledger, Marcellus, your hand on the route change. I have a witness who watched masked wolves in no kingdom's colors slaughter my convoy on your orders." For one instant, the mask slipped, not the silver one hiding his face, but the one he'd worn for 3 years, and beneath it, Killian saw something cold and calculating, and entirely without remorse. Then Marcellus smiled, bowed again, and melted into the crowd. Killian's blood went to ice. He scanned the hall, and found Winter across the floor near Dorian, unaware, laughing softly at something said to her, utterly unguarded. Marcellus was already moving toward her, hand slipping inside his cloak, and Killian understood with total, gutting clarity that a ledger meant nothing if the only living proof of his crime never lived to see midnight. He crossed that hall faster than he had ever moved in his life. He reached her half a second before Marcellus did, seizing the older man's wrist with a grip that cracked bone, wrenching a blade away before it ever cleared its sheath. The hall erupted, guards surging forward, Dorian's court crying out, Barrett already hauling Marcellus down with the flat, furious efficiency of a man who'd been waiting 3 years to hit something. In the chaos, Killian's hand caught the edge of Winter's silver mask, and it came away in his fingers, clattering to the stone floor in front of both kingdoms. The hall went utterly silent. She stood there bare-faced before hundreds of eyes, chest heaving, staring at Killian as he stared back at her, and he said it, not a whisper this time, not a private test in a crowded ballroom, but loud enough for every soul in that hall to hear, loud enough to break 3 years open at once. "I buried you 3 years ago." Somewhere behind her, Dorian went very still, and then, in front of his entire court, he did the one thing Killian never expected. He stepped forward, took her trembling hand, and told her everything. The border, the wreckage, the ring cut from her swollen finger, the years he'd let her believe she had no one, because losing her felt worse than any lie he could tell himself he was protecting her from. "Her name," Dorian said, voice raw, eyes never leaving her face, "is Winter. Queen of Ashwood, I should have told you the day I found you." Then he stepped back, physically, finally, completely, and let her go. The name broke over her like the moon breaking through cloud. Memory did not return gently. It returned all at once, a flood behind her eyes, a wedding beneath ash trees, a husband's laugh, an ambush, cold water, dying, and she staggered, gasping, into arms that had been empty for 3 years and finally, were not. Chapter 9. Marcellus confessed before dawn. Once the full weight of Duskmoor's dungeons and Ashwood's evidence made denial pointless, a jealousy over a border command Killian had given someone else, curdled over years into something that wanted a kingdom's grief more than it had ever wanted peace. He was stripped of title and sent to Ashwood in chains to face a council that had spent 3 years unknowingly thanking their queen's murderer for his condolences. Killian felt no triumph in it, only, finally, quiet. What Marcellus had tried to bury in a false war became, instead, the thing that ended one properly. Duskmoor and Ashwood signed their peace that same week, not the brittle, ceremonial kind built on masks and old suspicion, but something sturdier, forged in the wreckage of a shared betrayal. Two kingdoms who'd hated each other for the wrong reasons found, in the end, they had far more cause to be allies than enemies. Winter's memory never returned whole. Some mornings she still woke, reaching for details that simply weren't there. Her mother's face, the sound of her own wedding vows, and grieved those small, permanent gaps quietly, in private. But enough had come back to know her own heart, and what remained unremembered, she found, mattered less than she'd feared. She didn't love Killian because she recalled every reason to. She loved him because 3 years of fog hadn't been able to bury it, because her wolf had known him blind, because choosing him now, awake and clear-eyed and under no illusion, meant infinitely more than simply never having forgotten. "I keep waiting to feel like I owe you the woman I was," she admitted to him one evening, beneath the ash trees that had somehow, impossibly, begun to bud again outside her old chambers. "And I don't think I do. I think I just get to choose you, again, as whoever I am now." "Good," Killian said, "because that's the only version of you I actually have any right to ask for." Dorian left before the claiming moon rose, and to his credit, he left with more grace than the story had any obligation to give him. He found Winter alone in the garden the morning of his departure, and there was no scene, no last plea, only a quiet, aching honesty between two people who had genuinely loved each other, even if one love had been built on a lie the other never asked for. "I hope you find peace," she told him. "I hope you find every memory you're owed," he said, "and I hope none of them make you hate me more than you already might." He bowed, formal and final, and rode for Duskmoor to spend the coming years rebuilding a name that had been unfairly stained for 3 of them. A task, Barrett noted dryly, that would probably take him roughly as long as it took Barrett to work up the nerve to properly court Sarai, who had taken to reorganizing the entire Ashwood Council schedule without asking anyone's permission and daring them to complain. "You're doing the thing," Sarai told Barrett 3 weeks later, catching him staring at her across the war room with an expression he clearly thought was subtle. "I have no idea what you mean. The staring at a door thing. Except I'm not a door," she smirked, entirely too pleased with herself. "Ask me to the claiming feast properly, Beta, or I'm seating you next to General Holloway." He asked. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Under the next full moon, before both courts and every soul who'd once believed her buried, Killian claimed Winter as his Luna a second time, properly, publicly, no masks left between them, nothing hidden, nothing owed. His bite at her throat was gentler than the first time, and infinitely more certain. Outside her old chambers, the ash trees that had stood bare and dead for 3 long years broke fully into bloom that very night, as if they, too, had simply been waiting for her to come home.